Hi, and welcome to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast. And I've got a great guest today, a good friend of mine, Nick Reynolds. How are you, Nick?
I'm good, Steve. How's yourself, mate?
Very good, mate. Great to see you, and looking forward really to speaking to you about your life. And let's go right back to the start, Nick, and just a little bit about where you were born, a little bit about your parents.
Well, I was born in Kensington, funnily enough, St Mary Abbots, 1962. My mum was just an ordinary housewife, and my dad was a bit of a naughty chap at the time. And when I was a year old, he pulled off the great train robbery, and then for the next 5 years after that, I spent my life on the run with him. In America and Mexico until he come back, and that was the end of that little fucking escapade. 5 years on the run. I ended up back in England, and he spent the next 10 years in prison with me visiting him. There's always a price to pay, but that was the early years, which obviously only being a nipper, I don't really remember an awful lot of. Although I remember America and Mexico like yesterday, but it's like someone has stuck loads of little random bits of film together, that they don't have any particular narrative, but I've got all these crystal clear images of running around Mexico and America with my dad back in the day. That was my humble beginnings.
Your dad, of course, infamous train robber, as you say, the man who organised the biggest heist in the UK on from a train, the Royal Mail train of all trains as well, Bruce Reynolds. And I've just got to try and grasp what it must have been like for you, being on the run. You see, you haven't got many memories of it. I mean, how were you going to school in these different places?
Well, obviously, I was a year and a half when the train robbery happened. So, I mean, I wasn't at a schoolable age until I think I went to like a kindergarten in America. In Mexico. It was the American diplomats school that they had for all of the kids of American diplomats living in Mexico. So the first time I had schooling, I think I'd have been about 5. At that point, we were living quite securely in Mexico, and my dad had bought the franchise to Dunhills, so he was legitimately running Dunhills in Mexico, and we were living with the kind of with the top 2% of the country, I suppose, and he would have had a straight life, and I probably would have grown up there if it hadn't been for Buster Edwards came over to visit us in Mexico, and he was having problems being on the run, and basically he wanted to throw the towel in, I think. And as we know, he came back to England and did a deal, got Freddie Foreman, to broker him a deal. And then he got busted, Buster, and unfortunately the authorities, it didn't take them too long to work out where he'd been, and they figured out that maybe where he'd come from was where my dad might be, and that was it. The chips were up, and we had to bail out of Mexico, which was a bit of a shame. My life would have been entirely different, I think, if we'd have managed to stay out there.
Can you remember what it was like just trying to grasp the language out there? Because obviously you're a young kid. You don't know any different, I guess. But it must have been apparent to you that you're the minority, not the majority.
Well, but the thing is that obviously living in Mexico at that particular time, there was obviously a class divide from the kind of the working classes out there and the people that my dad hung out with, and to say the school I went to was like a school for the American diplomats. So the world we were living at was kind of at the top of the pile, if you like. As far as I was concerned, my dad was a businessman. It was only later on when I got a little bit wiser and we were moving around a lot and I had to keep changing identities with different passports. It was only then that I started really thinking that, my dad wasn't different from any other rich person that I'd met. And when I did start trying to think, well, hold on, he can't just be a straight businessman. Why all the running around? Why all the changing the names? And in my mind, I'd worked out, I thought he was a spy. You know, it didn't occur to me that he could have been a villain until when we came back to England. He got busted, in fact, and as I've said before, when the police came in and I let them in, I was 6.5, 7, I think. Early in the morning, they came running through the door, and for me, I thought it was a bit like a scene from John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. You know, I thought my dad was being rescued by the good guys. And when I found out that they were actually taking him away, and he said, "Sorry, son, you know, Daddy's got to go away. He's been a naughty boy." That was when first time it hit me. Hold on a minute, you're telling me that my dad's a villain? You know, that he's a bad guy. It didn't compute. It was never in my upbringing. I never see him or my mother stressed out, worried, looking over their shoulder, talking about anything dodgy or anything like that. You know, it was a big shock to me. And I still didn't really know what was going on, really, until I was maybe, even after my dad was nicked, I still didn't know an awful lot. My mum didn't tell me much. It was only when I discovered in the attic a load of suitcases. I think I must have been about 8.5, maybe 9 even. And I found a load of suitcases, all of newspaper clippings and everything, you know, and that was the first time I found out really who my dad was. Let alone, I did, you know, my Uncle John. It's like, you kidding? My Uncle John, who we lived with, I thought he was a train robber as well, you know, but he got away with it. As actually, you know, this is quite an interesting point. If they was to try the train robbers today, they would all get off with it, basically, because my Uncle John, he got let off because they found his fingerprints, allegedly, on a Monopoly board. And because they said that Monopoly board could have come from anywhere, the prints could have gone on any time. And just because the board was found at the farm doesn't mean he was there. You could have actually applied that to all of the robbers, because all of their prints are on movable objects that were only discovered. When I say discovered, I say that in parentheses or inverted commas. Back at the yard, you know, once their man had done the sellotape job and had transplanted all the bloody fingerprints. And so, you know, he got away, my Uncle John, purely because of that. And I think my dad's print was found on a tomato ketchup bottle, which my dad laughed at, saying he'd never touched a tomato ketchup bottle in his life. But anyway, my Uncle John got away with it. So when my dad was in prison, and you know, and I was staying with my Uncle John, I had no idea that he was one of the robbers, but he'd managed to get away with it. You know, and so it was only till I was about 8.5, 9 that I read all about this. And even then, it didn't really register until I think I was in my teens, and Piers Paul Reed, who wrote that book Alive about the guys who crashed up, I think it was in the Andes, and they ended up having to eat each other. He wrote this book called The Train Robbers, but he'd been spoofed, he'd been scammed by Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards into saying that the guy behind the Great Train Robbery and who put the money up was the Nazi poster boy Otto Skorzeny, who famously rescued Mussolini in a commando raid during the Second World War. And I mean, he was in a way involved with a train robbery, but not in the way that it was put out in this book. And as a result, they got an absolutely phenomenal book deal. I mean, it was ridiculous, the amount of money that was given. And of course, the whole book was a pack of lies. And my dad was pissed off at the time because I'd had an arrangement that no one was going to write a book till my dad was out. And of course, they put this scheme together while he was still in the nick. You know, he was one of the last guys to be let out, my dad. So subsequently, the book was a pile of shit. But when I was a teenager reading it, you know, it was like, bloody hell, I didn't really know any of this. And I got to be honest, up until that point, I wasn't even that interested, you know. Anyway, yeah, but I've gone off on a tangent. What was the question?
No, that's great. I mean, that's what the listeners love to hear. And when you do go off on a tangent, feel free. But the robbery itself, I mean, it was just, you know, so well planned, so well executed. It's just, I guess, from the British public's point of view, something which they got carried away in. And I think there's nothing more fascinating than watching those black and white news clips of the people of the time being interviewed about it. And actually people were going, well, good luck to them. It was like a Robin Hood kind of robbery, wasn't it?
Well, It wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, the thing is that even the name, the Great Train Robbery. You know, I remember I've read so many things with people moaning, complaining, saying, you know, why did the train robbers refer to it as a Great Train Robbery? Why was it called the Great Train Robbery? What's so great about it? And you know, the robbers never called it the Great Train Robbery. It was always called the train. And initially, when the robbery was discovered, it was published in the media as the Cheddington mail van raid, which isn't very sexy and doesn't sell papers. And it was some bright spark at the Daily Sketch who suddenly thought, hold on a minute, you know, the very first kind of recognized movie that had special effects and a proper script was 1903 by Edison, and it was called The Great Train Robbery. And it's a very famous early black and white American flick. And at that point in England, all you generally get on all day in the cinemas was cartoons and cowboy and Indian movies. You know, not people didn't have televisions. Not many people had televisions back then. And so England was kind of in the thralls of the Wild West and American TV and movies. And then, of course, you've got this robbery. Then you got the Daily Sketch, this guy who's called it, instead of the Cheddington mail van raid, he called it the Great Train Robbery. And just to cement it quite firmly in people's minds and to sex it up, they used the old Wild West font, you know, which is the type you see on the old wanted posters. And of course, that caught the public's imagination that we've got our own homegrown Jesse James and Butch Cassidy kind of thing. And there's a tremendous kind of history and romancing the outlaw in America, whereas we don't really have that in England, apart from, say, Jack Shepherd, the thief, or maybe Dick Turpin. And then maybe in the 60s, you got the fetishization of the Crays and the Richardsons. But everyone loves an outlaw, you know, to a degree, particularly if they get turned into this sort of semi-quasi mythical folk sort of status. So the media blew the train robbery up purely by likening it to some kind of Wild West American outlaw exploit, with the flying squad, you know, as the sheriff with his posse after the men. But also at the time, the country was reeling because your general working class people weren't that well informed in those days, and they generally believed that most politicians were decent, honest, law-abiding citizens. You know, we know better today, and so they were absolutely transmogrified when they found out of what became famously known as the Profumo affair, where it turned out that the war minister was shagging a prostitute, Christine Keeler, who was also fucking a Russian naval military attaché who was actually KGB. And when they found out that the government was all involved in all sorts of nefarious sexual activities with brothels and all the sorts of things that, you know, they weren't supposed to be doing in the eyes of the general public, they were kind of horrified. And the press had an absolute field day in teasing the government about this huge embarrassment, you know, and it certainly rocked the sort of leafy consensus of sort of sleepy England into shock and horror. And then the train robbery came around, and then the press used that as another axe to grind about how incompetent and useless and how the government was kind of not doing their job properly. And so in order to try to put out a positive message, the government came down really, really, really heavy on the train robbers. And what this actually did is it garnered public sympathy, you know, by giving them, when they finally nicked them, they gave them 30 years in prison. And this actually backfired on them, because if you killed someone in those days, the most you got was 25 years, you know. The train robbers got 30 years. So that made it a very clear signal that from the government's point of view, that property was worth more than life. Never a good idea. And the second thing was, the theory was, if you carried a gun, obviously, you know, any other future robbers thinking, well, if we carry a gun, the police aren't armed, that means we've got a jolly good chance of getting away if we're armed. And of course, so what that brought in is, unfortunately, the government literally shot themselves in the foot there, because most villain would go, if I've got a gun, and I shoot someone escaping, in theory, I'll get 5 years less than what the train robber's got, you know, because you only got 25 years for murder. So from that moment on, every villain doing a big job carried a gun. But it backfired on the government as well, apart from the fact about the guns. It elicited public sympathy, and it divided the public. And as you're saying, there's some great BBC film clips, you know, where they're asking the public, well, you know, 30 years, what do you think? And some people are saying, you know, good riddance, they should throw away the keys. Other people are saying, no, I think it's really unfair and I hope the others get away. And, you know, the public was really, really divided because, you know, they could see that the government had fucked up on one side with the Profumo thing and was trying to cover it all up and come on strong with the train robbers. And the way that the media teased the establishment so much about it, I mean, it was huge in the papers. I mean, you know, it was, you could liken, if you like, the Beatles were total British establishment. The train robbers were the anti-Beatles of the 60s. Every paper was obsessed with it. You know, it was like, you know, if you think, my dad always said if Vietnam was the first televised war, you know, you could say that the Great Train Robbery was the first proper media crime, as big as Jack the Ripper, still going on and on and on and on. And I mean, apart from the fact there was a massive reward, a house was £3,000 then, they put a 250 grand reward up, you know, for any information leading to the arrest of the robbers, which was unheard of in those days. And then, of course, you had the fact that there was a couple of deals done because the old Bill knew who the robbers were. It was just a case they had to prove it. And some of the guys, as we know, they got fitted up. One guy was innocent, had nothing to do with the train robbery. He died in prison, innocent man, guy called Bill Bowl. And the others, who obviously I'm not going to say who their name is, some of them cut a deal with the police because the police was quite happy. They got plenty of people, so they could say, we've done our job. We've nicked enough members, you know, to keep the public happy. We've done our job right, but they really hadn't got any money back. And that was a big issue. So with some of the guys, they offered them a deal and said, give us half your money and, you know, we'll drop you from inquiries. And, I forgot where.
Do you think the heavy sentences you were talking about, Nick? I mean, they were dished out, obviously, you know, to the train robbers, 307 years collectively. They got the Crays, of course, and the Richardsons both got hefty sentences for what they were up to in the 1960s. Do you think that a lot of the sentence and the idea of a long sentence came from the injuries sustained by the train driver at the time, Jack Mills?
Well, can I turn it back? I mean, it's interesting you should mention this because everyone always says, oh, it's a jolly good caper, except for the violence on Jack Mills, which wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the plan. Yes, they had a spare train driver, which Ronnie Biggs had supplied. But the only reason they had him was because they thought if the driver says, fuck you, I'm not going to do it, you know, they didn't have any plans. They thought, we're not going to torture the guy to make him do it. If he says he's not going to do it and he's not going to do it, we'll have another driver. So there was no need for violence other than the threat of violence, which, as you know, in a lot of jobs, that's what people want. They want the threat of violence. They want to look like they can do the business, but they don't want to do the business because it changes the nature of the crime. It changes the sentence if they get caught, etc., etc. So there was supposed to be no violence. It was a real fuck up that the last guy brought in on the job purely as a bit of muscle, because obviously that had to shift like 2 tons of money in a very short amount of time. When it was Gordon's job to grab hold of the train driver when they jumped into the carriage. But when he jumped in the carriage, the train driver was kicking the fuck out of Buster Edwards' face, who was coming up the ladder. So Gordon leapt in, just put his arms around the driver and pulled him away and passed him to the guy behind him. And almost instinctively, and I don't know why the guy did it, and I suppose neither did he. And all he was supposed to do was to grab hold of Mills, and he whacked Mills over the head. And Mills went down, and the damage that was done to him wasn't the kosh on the head. He cut the side of his head on the part of the dashboard, which had a bit of a corner on it. And at the time, obviously, the government wanted to give these guys a really big sentence, and they needed quite a big hook to basically justify how they could give such a big sentence. Now, in those days, crime was very violent, and as you know well, this is a topic that you've been studying for years, and the coppers gave as good as the villains did in those days, and a violent crime was a really violent crime. And I'm not making any excuses. I'm not an apologist for anything that happened that night. But to be quite honest, a whack on the head in those days was not what you would call a violent crime. Now, to put this in perspective, Judge Edmund Davis, who gave the sentences away, when he pronounced his sentence, and I can't remember what you said word for word, but it was more or less to sum him up. He said, to anyone who might have any romantic ideals about these guys, etc., being glamorous thieves, they're basically a bunch of nasty, violent thugs, and thus we're going to give them, this sentence, this 30-year sentence for this horrific deed. Now, the same judge who gave him 30 years, a year previous, there was a guy who had a row in a hotel, and he went back and he set fire to the hotel, and 13 people burned to death, and he only gave the guy 5 years. So it just puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
But he'd been told on a government level, you've got to give these guys the maximum sentence. So, to a certain degree, the whole thing about Jack Mills was blown out of proportion. Now, this is well known. If you dig around, there was a woman called Petter Fordham who wrote a book on the train robbers. Her husband was actually one of the QCs on the case, and she got very pally with Mills, and he pulled her aside at one point and had said to her, I'm really nervous about this because I've got to go in and say this about the villains and say this and how they treated me and everything. He goes, but to be quite honest, he said, and he was worried about if he said anything bad about them, that would assist in them getting a longer sentence, that there might be some reprisal against himself. So he said to her, he felt in a very uncomfortable position because he said that the robbers had treated him like a gentleman, had even offered him a load of money. And he had explained to the police what had happened, and that the injury wasn't him bitten bashed on the head, but as when he stumbled and hit his head on the dashboard. And he told Petter Fordham this, but the old Bill had said to him, "You don't mention none of that. You just say these bastards scared the living daylights out of you. They battered you completely." Which he didn't want to say because it wasn't the case, and subsequently he wasn't that badly injured, but they had to make out he was, and to justify or to make it look like he'd been badly injured, they had to say they retired him, and he didn't want to be retired. He could have still worked, but they had to retire him, and they shoved him in a shunter's yard where apparently, from what I've heard, he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulders, worried that there'd be some retribution, because as far as he was concerned, it was his evidence. He was the chief witness into saying these guys were violent brutes, into which elicited the 30-year sentence. So he felt very guilty that he was, because he was an honest working class man, and he was a hero defending his train and stuff like that. And I know his family have always been most upset about the way the train robbery has been glorified, or my father or Ronnie Biggs or whatever, kind of seem to make a living out of it, and not seem to have an awful lot of regard, if you like, or sympathy, which they did for Mills. But, you got to be really aware of the facts. And I don't even think that Mills's family, to be quite honest, they saw their dad a harrowed and broken man, but I don't think they really appreciate the reason why. And it was because he felt at odds with himself, that when he was in court, he had to put on a show. and follow what the police had told him. They threatened to take away his pension if he didn't lie in court, if he didn't say that it was them bashing him on the head. And people might say, listening to this, well, what difference? They bashed him on the head and then he fell over and he hit his head. Well, the difference is, if I trip you up and you crack your head on the pavement, I'm still responsible for tripping you up, but you can't prove that I deliberately cracked your head. That's an accident that happened because I tripped you. And so that's a similar thing. The robbers wouldn't have been able, if they'd have said in court that the blow that needed the stitches wasn't deliberate, it was because of they would have been able to make such a big deal about it, and the sentences would have been a lot less. And then the media wouldn't have blown it up into what it is. And it's the government and it was the media that turned this thing into like a big major criminal soap opera, and people are still talking about it today. Like all crimes, media know nothing like crimes like sells like crime, and the more they sensationalize it, the bigger. I mean, it's like they invent nicknames for villains. I mean, for the rest of his life, Roy James is always referred to as the Weasel, which he was never ever called. That was made up in the newspapers. Roy James the Weasel, because it conjured up this idea of this slippery super cat burglar, racing driver character. So yeah, as always, it's always the media that blows these people up. They give them the oxygen of publicity, So as far as I'm concerned, they're the villains of the piece. As my dad, I remember when the first time my dad met Biggsy, Ronnie Biggs, I went out for my 30th birthday to Brazil, and when I got them back together after they hadn't seen each other since the day after the robbery. I remember a conversation my dad was having with Ron, and he said, the media. He said the media was Frankenstein, and they turned us into Frankenstein's monster. So yeah, it's always the media. They noticed ever since the days of Jack the Ripper with the Penny Dreadfuls. They used to sell like hotcakes, and people are fascinated by crime, as you well know. You carved yourself a nice little niche into kind of exploring the fascination that people have with these transgressors and people who don't live the normal life.
You were still quite young when your dad got that 25-year sentence, and the train robbers were jailed. What can you remember? Did you feel anything? I mean, obviously, your dad says, "I've been a naughty boy," and off he goes. Maybe your mum doesn't speak to you a great deal, but can you remember anything? Were you told that your dad wasn't going to be coming back for a long time?
Well, I said I was at 7.5.
Yeah.
It was all. I think I was in shock initially when the old Bill come and took him away, and I only realised the severity of it, even though he said Daddy's been a very naughty boy and he's got to go away for a long time. And I said, how long? And he said, don't know, but don't know yet. And I still didn't really sink in until I saw the state of my mum. And it was purely the fact that she was, sobbing her heart out that I realised this wasn't a particularly good thing. And it's still, there was kind of numb from the thing. We went to go and stay with my Uncle John, one of the robbers who got away. And it was only when I first went to visit him in prison, it must have taken maybe half hour, 40 minutes, going through all these passageways with the screw, with these Blakeys. I still remember clip, clap, clip, clop down a passageway with a big bunch of keys, rattle, rattle, clunk, clunk, doing the lock. Then we go in and he'd slam that one. And it seems we went through about 20 corridors. It was like a big labyrinth where we, just till we were going finally round and round in circles, we finally got into the centre. And in the centre of this big cage labyrinth was a bloody glass cube. And my dad was sat in the glass cube. It was something like out of a fucking movie. I mean, you hear about poor old Charlie Bronson in his concrete block. Well, It was like that, except it was made out of glass, like something out of a Bond movie. And I just couldn't get it. I just thought, well, hold on a minute. 40 minutes walking to get through all these doors, and in the middle was just me dad in this thing. It just didn't compute that what could he have possibly have done to have got himself in that situation. And it was because I was staying with my uncle at the time, my Uncle John, and he downplayed the whole thing because he'd been exposed in the media, and everyone knew who he was, despite the fact he'd got away with the robbery, and he was trying to play the whole thing down. So being in those surroundings, had I been anywhere else, I probably would have been a lot more aware of what was kind of going on. But he tried to keep that away from me and his kids to a certain degree. So as I said, it didn't really affect me in that way. It was just saying, oh shit, my dad's locked up now. I then got sent to boarding school, so I was out of the picture. And in a way, I suppose, we'd gone from living this great privileged family life, the three of us, to all of a sudden my dad was locked up, and for all intent and purposes, so was I.
Can you remember what it was like for you when your dad came home? I mean, was that 78? I think when he got out of Maidstone.
Yeah, it was 78. Yeah, well, I remember having this kind of bit of a panic because we'd kind of got through the prison years by planning to do all these great adventures when he got out, and I thought, fuck school, fuck doing anything. The moment my dad comes out of Nick, he's going to rescue me, and we're going to shoot off into some exotic location, do some major crime, and live on the high life and continue, like the old days. In my naivety, that's kind of what I thought. And as it got closer and closer to my dad's release, and wondering about what he was going to do and where he was going to live and stuff like that, it suddenly dawned on me, well, we'd built up so much, that so much hope that when we got together, when he came out, I thought to myself, I kind of panicked and thought, well, what if it doesn't work out? All of these props, if you like, that we'd kind of set in place to get through this 10-year period. I mean, he got 25 years, but he only did 10 and a half. All the devices that we'd used to kind of make that time easier. When it actually came up to living it, I think my bottle went a little bit, and I was thinking, well, what happens if he comes out and he doesn't live up to my expectations? Or it dawned on me that, he had to get his life together, and me being around when I didn't really have any focus, I hadn't planned about anything. I just thought, I don't have to worry about anything. As soon as my dad's out, I'm off. I'm out of here. And so because of that, I joined the Navy. So it worked out. I'd signed up before he came out, and about the time he came out of his establishment, I went into one. But what that did is that bought us a bit of time. So with the first year when I was at training, it gave me before I was actually on a ship, it gave me the opportunity to be with him at weekends, and then I'd be away for training, and then I'd come back at the weekends. And that worked things out because it meant he didn't have to worry about me while he tried to get his shit together. I wasn't in the way, so to speak. And it took a lot of pressure off all the expectations about what we were going to do, at that point. And it kind of it worked out because, it was good because I got into something which I wouldn't have done otherwise. And as I said, it gave my dad an opportunity to get his life back together without me sort of like going, Dad, what are we going to do? I'm bored, Dad. I'm bored, Come on, can't we do another robbery? Can't we go back to Mexico? Can't we do this? I want to be rich again.
Well, you've segued nicely into my next question there, because I was going to say, was he tempted to go back into crime when he was released? I mean, was there ever a thought of potentially doing another big robbery?
Oh yeah, that's why he was back. he came back. I mean, living on the run is a very expensive business, and he spent his money, despite the fact he was earning good wedge in Mexico. When the funds were running low, I think when he was down to his last 25 grand, which ain't much today, I suppose, but 25 grand back then, I don't know, it's probably maybe £1 million today, something. Yeah, I don't know, maybe 80 grand or something. He come back. He got in touch with Fred about doing another job. They looked at a few bits of work, but my dad was basically, no one really wanted to work with him because it was like, what the fuck are you doing back here? You're too hot a potato to handle. And I think also he was getting a bit tired of looking over his shoulder. And I think he started taking risks. I think almost subconsciously, he was almost willing the old Bill to come on. I'm getting a bit tired now. Come and get me. But he had another job planned, and if that had worked out, we were going to go and grow up and move to New Zealand, which I always thought sounded like a good plan until I went out there a few years back. Beautiful country, but he would have stuck out like a sore thumb over there in the 60s. So I don't think that would have actually worked out very well for him. But as it happened, that opportunity didn't even happen because someone grasped him up, and and as you know, we were living in Torquay at the time, and the old Bill come and got him down there, and that was 5 years. Tommy Butler had been chasing after my dad, and he should have retired actually, but he didn't want to until he caught my dad. And when he finally did get him, and my dad said, well, funny enough, it was, got historical words when he busted at my dad's bedroom, and he said to my dad, "Hello, Bruce, it's been a long time." My dad turned around to him and said, "Hello, Tom, c'est la vie." And he turned around to my dad and he said, "You know what, Bruce? You'd have actually made a good cop." And my dad said, "You know what, Tom? You'd have made a good thief." And he said, "Anyway, Tom, can we do a deal? Anyway, we can cut a deal." And he went, "No, Bruce." He says, "Look, mate," he says, "I've had some of the best holidays of my life the last 5 years, going to exotic locations on the pretense of I'm following up a tip that you've been seen there. So I can't now say that you weren't a major ring leader and I've wasted all the taxpayers' money on chasing a bit player. I'm really sorry." He goes, "The best deal I can do for you is let your wife go free. You give us what money you got left and you plead guilty. Put your hands up and we'll leave your wife out of it." And so, given that choice, there wasn't really much he could do other than basically, come clean, and that was it.
Yeah, obviously he did get a chance to write these memoirs and put a book together, and the autobiography of a thief, a bestseller, and no the wonder, because the architect of the biggest robbery in the UK puts a book out. People who are interested in crime are going to read it. Was he happy with the book?
Yeah, he was and he wasn't. And the reason being, the publishers took more than 100 pages out. Some of it was stuff because it had a lot about Princess Margaret in it. There was some other stuff that he figured, certain people might want to sue him. The publishers basically just went, "This is a little bit hairy. We don't risk put this out," But the worst thing that pissed him off the most, and an example of this, of one little bit, is where he likened the assassination of Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson, one of the train robbers. He was executed in Spain by his villa, by his swimming pool, similar to the Great Gatsby. And for those who don't know, the Great Gatsby is a fictional character that comes from a very famous book by the author F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it's been made into a movie with Robert Redford playing the Great Gatsby, and then subsequently it was remade with Leonardo DiCaprio playing the Great Gatsby. Anyway, in my dad's book and his biography, he likened the assassination of Charlie Wilson by his swimming pool to the assassination of the Great Gatsby. And a portion of this was taken out. And when my dad said, you know, why have you edited that bit and taken out F. Scott Fitzgerald? And they turn around to him and says, look, Bruce, don't want to be funny, mate, but the kind of people reading your book are the sort of people that are going on holiday and just want an easy read. They're going to be the Sun readers, you know, that kind of type. And we've got to be honest, Bruce, they won't have a clue who F. Scott Fitzgerald is. And my dad was furious about it. So, you know, how fucking dare you, for starters, patronising my so-called readership when you don't, you know, who are you to basically take that stance? And so he was quite annoyed that it was delitterized to a certain amount. There was a lot of literary references and stuff that a lot of people would have gotten appreciated, and not only that, would have had more insight into how my dad's brain worked and to what inspired him and to the kind of people that my dad was fascinated by. You know, he was a smart guy anyway, but he educated himself in prison. The person that went in was a different person that came out, and that reflected in his book, you know, and a lot of that was taken out, and somewhere, if I can find it, because I'd love to put it back in, because he hand wrote the book originally, and there's one thing, I don't know if you've ever read a book called The Definitive Great Train Robbery, which is an absolute load of bollocks. And this guy, Nick Russell Pavey, there's a long story where he fell out with my dad because this guy was trying to sell a book on the basis that my dad had written a foreword, but my dad hadn't. And subsequently, it's a long story, and it all come out in the run one day. But he then had to put, once he couldn't use my dad for this particular book, he needed to basically say that my dad wasn't the ringleader, and he had to put someone else up. So in their book, they went for the angle that Gordon Goody was the main guy. And in part of the process of trying to put my dad down, they even suggested that my dad didn't write his own book, which made me furious. And of course, this book only came out after my dad died. They wouldn't dare to put it out when he was alive, because he could have just said this is an absolute load of bollocks, you know. And I saw my dad write his book. He wrote it by hand, and then he typed it up on an old typewriter, like finger by finger. Then he gave it to my mum. And my mum then typed it up on her word processor, and then that was what was given to the publishers, you know. Yeah, so his book, was he happy with it? To a degree, other than the fact, like I said, he felt that the bollocks had been cut out of it. Because anything, you know, that was kind of a bit near the knuckle. As I said, the publishers played it safe and they took it out, and a lot of intellectual references that would have tickled the brains of the cognoscenti, if you like, was removed from it, and so what you get is a sort of slightly sterilized, sanitized, you know, de-intelligized version. So from that point of view, you know, he wasn't that pleased with it, but it did very well, and it launched his career as a writer, which is how he always saw himself and what he always wanted to be. And subsequently, you know, he was a regular writer for The Guardian and stuff like that, and he got to write articles for classic cars, and he got involved in countless documentaries, and also, you know, he got to be, they used to use him for movies, you know, that they bring him on board as what's the phrase that they use for it?
Like I don't know, like a consultant. That's it. Yeah,
like they did with Fred for the Craze. You know, they pay you a load of money just not to rubbish the product and to add a bit of your authority to it, you know, like, so it's as if, yes, this has been certified by a proper villain that this is all accurate, if you like. And so he I think I worked out one day he'd made more money from books, articles, and being a consultant on various films than he actually made out of the train robbery.
Well, segueing nicely into the film then, Buster. I mean, what did he make of that? I mean, it's
he got 20 grand just not to slag it off. He always called it Carry On Train Robbery, which essentially it was. And I mean, this is quite a funny story in as much as, at that time, Phil Collins, who we can see there in the centre, Phil Collins was probably one of the richest, most popular, most successful recording artists in the world. Looking at it now, you'd think, really, but he was absolutely global at the time they did Buster. And he'd been grafting quite hard with Midure from Ultravox. They were both trying to get their knighthood, and they were working with Prince Charles and the Prince's Trust. And it was an amazing coup that Buster originally was scheduled for the royal premiere. And I've even got the original tickets that were printed up with HRH Charles and HRH Diana will be attending this gala, and the irony that they were coming royal performance to a film by one of the world's most richest successful pop stars, who was celebrating a bunch of robbers who had basically stolen his mum's train. Because essentially the Royal Mail, belongs to the Crown. And nobody saw the irony or even really the stupidity in it, except for Alexander Walker, the famous film critic of the Evening Standard of the time. And he wrote a whole page in the Evening Standard pleading for Charlie and Diana to snub it and not to turn up. And there was a cartoon of Charlie and Diana going to another premiere, and make up one of the craze, like what, and then it was kind of like, as if to say that from now on, all the royal premieres were just going to be films about British villains. And anyway, as a result of him pleading, and it was a big, massive article, they suddenly realised, to their shock horror, this gave out the wrong signal to the public. And it was really, would have been quite scandalous had they have turned up at this event. And so they dropped out, and in a big hurry, they had to put stickers over the HRH Charles and Diana. They didn't have time to reprint all the tickets, so they just put a little sticker over that and just turned it into a charity fundraising event for the Prince's Trust. So that was a bit of a debacle to start from. Now, for some reason, and I spoke to Larry Lamb about this afterwards, who's a diamond geezer. There's Larry on the left there. And lovely bloke. When the film went out to America, it did quite well in England, and of course with the soundtrack, and that was all in the charts as well because he did the music for it as well, Phil. And in an original version that I saw of it, they had a great section when they're unloading the money off the Land Rovers in the farm, and the music in the background was the Beatles' Money, down, 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 and it was really, really good. And then Michael Jackson wouldn't give them the rights to it because he owned the Beatles songs at that particular time, and which is another bloody story. And so instead, Phil Collins wrote this really dreary bit of film music, and that particular scene when that's happening doesn't really work anywhere near as well now, I don't think. But anyway, when they went to America, and there should have been a lot of publicity, they were in the hotel, and Larry rang Phil up, and said, so, what's the plan? What are we going to do? Where are we going tonight? I'm thinking that him and Phil were going to go out together and push the movie and be seen. And Phil more or less said, fuck off, you're on your own. kind of thing, and he didn't really push it, didn't do any publicity. I don't know why. Maybe Phil was so gutted and disappointed that the film had been snubbed by Charles and Diana, and he wasn't going to get his knighthood. It had left a bad taste in his mouth, and so he didn't want to promote the film in the States. I don't know, but subsequently it was very poorly presented in America, and it just fizzled out. Buster didn't like the film. I mean, it was mostly embarrassing when we were sat at, it was me, my dad, my mum. We were sat next to Buster and his wife June, and I remember there was the dialogue in it was awful, and there was a scene in it where my mum and dad are in some open top sports car. I think it's a big red Cadillac or something, and they're driving off to Acapulco Airport to go and pick up Buster and his wife June. And my mum's saying, what are they going to do? What are they going to do when they get here? There's no bingo halls, and, Mexico's hardly going to be their cup of Corona. And, terrible dialogue, and trying to sort of set my mum and dad up as if they were, this super glamorous couple who kind of, really knew what they were kind of doing, and that Buster and June were the comedy element of it, kind of thing, which was really unfair on Buster and on June. And also they tried to turn the whole thing into like a love story. They used the train robbery as a very uncomfortable coat hook, if you like, to hang a love story on that didn't fucking exist, because in the film, she can't bear it anymore, and she comes back to England, and he's so heartbroken without her that he comes back to England and gives himself up, which doesn't make any sense anyway, because if you're heartbroken with someone, you're not going to go and put yourself in the nick, is it? That's not going to bring you any closer to them.
No, definitely not.
Yeah, so but in the film, that's what happened. He was heartbroken, so he came back, had a night of fun with her, then give himself up. Whereas in reality, he did a deal, they came back together, and at that particular point in the relationship, to be honest, they weren't really getting on. I think that the stress and strain of being on the run had quite, quite a negative effect on their relationship, as you can imagine. And subsequently, Buster, I mean, he did a deal, luckily, and he only ended up doing what I think 7 years, 7 years, I think 8 years, maybe. Although very tragic, his end, very, very tragic, as we know. Poor old Uncle Jack, as I knew him. He hung himself, which is very sad.
Yeah, very, very sad. Your life has took some twists and turns, and you've had a really, meteoric rise, really, in different fields. And this was the one that I really loved, and it was the Cons to Icons exhibition. Sadly, we never got it to Newcastle. We were let down with finance. I remember trying to get that deal sorted out for you. But
we can always do it again, Steve.
I'd love to, because I really do think this would grasp the public's imagination. There's a new set of people who are into true crime. There's huge platforms, and I think people would. But what was the inspiration behind doing the masks of some infamous criminals, including your dad?
Well, funny enough, that was that one you just done there, which is called Dreaming of El Dorado, the one with the gold train coming out of his mouth. Yeah. That's what my dad always said. He was dreaming of El Dorado, looking for the big one, which was the train robbery was his big one. And ever the kind of poet romantic that my dad was, he kind of likened him and the train robbery to the story of Moby Dick and Captain Ahab, and obviously he was Captain Ahab, and the train was the big whale, and he said, it was too big, it ended up choking him, really, literally. So I was working on that particular sculpture. I was doing random sculptures, and this book that I had, on the back of it, it had a section about how to mold a person's face, and I was fascinated by this. So I said, Dad, come in the kitchen, and I've got this idea, and I want to subject you to this. So I did it, and I thought, right, I'm going to do something with it, and I'm going to put this train coming out of his mouth. And anyway, we were then that particular day. It was Ronnie's funeral was on telly, and obviously we were both invited, but my dad at that particular time didn't want any association. He didn't have a problem with Ron and Reggie. He knew them. He was in Borstal with them, and Ron had, believe it or not, had quite a bit of respect for my old man, and so did Reggie, and they got on all right. But my dad saw them, they were gangsters and he was a thief. And, my dad being him thought he was a lot more suave, sophisticated, elegant than them. And he thought he was a cut above them because he thought anything that used violence instead of brains, wasn't his kind of thing. That doesn't mean to say he didn't have any respect for them. It just wasn't his thing. And he didn't want the train robbery to be associated or seen in the same light. He saw the kind of crime he did as very, very different to the kind of crime that the Crays or the Richardsons did. And as such, he snubbed Ronnie's funeral. We didn't go. And even though I grew up hearing about them, I'd seen Ronnie loads of times and waved at him at Parkhurst in the visiting room. And he even gave me a painting, and stuff like that. And where was I?
just how it came really to taking that idea forward from putting the mask on.
Oh yeah, so this was it. I was watching the funeral. I was watching the funeral, and although I was aware of the Craze at this particular time, other than the likes of yourself and people I'd see at funerals, I didn't think it was a big deal. And I was quite gobsmacked to see all these people lying in the streets and everything. And my dad just blurted out there and then, he said, never mind doing my head, he should have done Ronnie's. Judging by the size of the funeral, it might have been worth a few quid. And then when I read in the paper that they'd done a check on the numbers and said it was the most amount of people that had come out for a funeral since Winston Churchill, I thought, this is absolutely phenomenal. This coincided with the same time that Lenny McLean's book came out, The Governor. And then this was followed by a series of books written by guys that had been locked up, that had a name for themselves in the 60s. And they were coming out of prison and they're writing their memoirs, which suddenly become bestsellers. And this was in the mid-90s, and Lock, Stock came out. And it all happened all at one time. And as a result, there was this sudden knock-on sort of gangster chic phenomenon, even in fashion. And, everything went a bit 60s villain styly for like about a year. It all went the kind of the rage. And it was at that time. And that series, Underworld, came out. That was based on the book written by Duncan Campbell, which is a phenomenal TV series. And it was in the middle of all of that, and I just thought, you know what? Growing up all my life with a dad in prison had always been a stigma, and all of a sudden, it was almost like having a dad that was a rock star. It was like my dad was Mick Jagger suddenly in that particular climate. And that surprised me and shocked me so much that I came up with this idea, the fact that all these criminals were being turned into iconic people. And once again, by the media, they were pushing the books. They were writing about the books in the papers. And I thought, this is very interesting. What does it say about us and socially today? And in a world where people that were once vilified by the media can suddenly be fated on the celebrity circuit by the very same people who were shocked and put them down in the beginning, and this, I just thought, well, I'm going to do an exhibition, which basically, makes this statement about how and why are these people famous and what is the fascination people have. So that's really kind of what got me started. And I just thought, well, I've done my dad's head. Obviously, I've missed out on Ron, but I said to my dad there and then, all right, give me the list of, like, say, 10 of England's most famous living criminals who's left. And he gave me a list. And, I then went out, and it took me 5 years, to get them all and convince them to let me shove straws up their nose and cover their head for a couple of hours in plaster. And as you know, I nearly killed Mad Frank. That would have been that would have been something else if he'd have died.
It's great stuff. I mean, there was a lovely brochure made, etc. And I remember going down to the night at the TARDIS in London, and it was fantastic. The TARDIS studios, just to go in and look at it, and then subsequently went on to other places. But fantastic. Anybody gets a chance to look at it, just Google Cons to Icons. There's still a couple of great articles and stuff online available for people to watch. So obviously you've got a real taste for music as well, and obviously I've had the privilege of seeing you perform on many occasions with the Alabama 3. And for those people who don't know who the Alabama 3 are, they have got a website which you need to get on. Just search for the Alabama 3. I believe it's .com. I might stand corrected, but I think it's alabama3.com, and get yourself on there to see it. But Nick, of course, you are part of that, and I guess they're synonymous and probably most well known and for writing the theme tune to probably the best gangster series ever, The Sopranos. How did that come about?
It's the story's been told a million times. Every time I've heard it, it's been slightly different.
Does it change? I've just heard Larry, actually, Rob, speaking about it on Talking Sopranos, because I've been listening to their podcast, and I know that he was on, and he said that it was a song that was written. I'd never heard this story. It's a song that was written for about a girl in a relationship or something like that. Is that true, or is this just?
That is really true. It's the story was inspired by a woman called Sarah Thornton, who was basically a victim of domestic abuse. And her husband was a violent American cop who used to beat the crap out of her. And one night she basically had enough, and she grabbed his service-issued pistol and shot him.
Wow!
And it was a big case, and she got and obviously she got away with it. So really, the song was a tribute to survivors of domestic violence, and but. When David Chase, who wrote The Sopranos, it was his idea, when he was pitching the show, he had an idea that he wanted every episode to start with a different song. And each song would be some kind of reflection, if you like, of that particular episode, or would be a musical way of setting up the mood and tone of each episode. And he thought, well, I've got to come in strong on my pitch. So I've got to have, my best idea for the first sort of, show. And also I've got to have the best kind of tune that kind of sets the whole thing up. And he literally, while driving on the freeway, just as you see in the opening of The Sopranos, he heard the song on the radio. And he thought, wow, this is great. This is the song. Get myself a gun. This is banging. He wasn't even listening to the lyrics particularly, except for the chorus. And so when he did his pitch, this is how he sold the whole series with his idea and with this tune. And then they said to him, this is such a good tune, just keep it all the way through. Don't change it. Don't change the music for every episode. So that's how it became synonymous with it. Then the guy had to find out who the band were because of legal reasons. There's a band called Alabama in America, and they sued. Well, they went through the motions of threatening to sue Alabama 3. So we had to drop the Alabama 3 name, and in America we're called A3. Yeah. And he thought the band was American, so he had to do a bit of detective work to find out who we were. Was very surprised to find out that it was actually a British band of people taking the piss out of Americans, putting in American accents, because that's what Alabama 3 does. We sing about America seen through a glass darkly, if you like. And you know, and that the song wasn't about gangsters either. But it, anyway, a deal was done. I mean, the story goes, the band got a phone call with the management did. HBO was starting. It's a brand new TV channel. They're 10 a penny in America. They come and go all the time. And it was like, why should this one be any different? They want to do a series like a crime soap opera, but based on something like Goodfellas meets The Godfather. And they want to use that tune, and I think the general consensus at the time was, okay, well, that sounds like a shit idea, and it's probably not it'll probably get dropped after series 1. And of course, it ended up being a worldwide phenomenon, and something which the band is most appreciative of, because, we've been going, 25, 30 years now? Well, in fact, we're re-releasing it. We're re-releasing it. I think next year, maybe.
Fantastic.
25 years. So
wow.
I think there's talk about redoing it, or something or other
Great stuff.
To mark that.
That's great stuff. What are you up to now then? Because obviously, you're a busy man. You're Alabama 3 still tour, as you've already said. I know the last time we physically met, before COVID, I think it was, that we talked about, different documentary ideas that you had. Are any of them off the ground or further forward?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the COVID thing put a bit of it kind of slowed all of that down. I'd been doing documentaries. I'd done a series of music documentaries, and I'd made a couple of movies, full-length movies that I was producing, writing some of the music, and getting little bit acting parts in. And then I worked really hard for 2 years on a documentary. It was the last one that I did on Brian Jones, called Brian Jones, Life and Death of a Rolling Stone, which I'm very proud of, and if anyone hasn't seen it, I strongly recommend you get it. It's on all the viewing platforms, or you can get it. It was #1 on Amazon, just DVD, but there was it's a long story. There was a cock up with the manufacturing and this, that, and it should have done an awful lot better than it did, and we had over 60 cinema screenings cancelled in the States because of COVID. And it just kind of hit a wall, and took the wind out of my sails on that. And as you know, doing documentaries, they take over your life. Yeah. And I'm doing so many other things with Alabama 3. I've got my business. I make death masks. I'm the only guy in England that does death masks. So I've got my hand full kind of doing that. Plus, I do other art, and I'm in the process at the moment of it's all early days yet, but it's going to be the 60th anniversary of the train robbery, not next year, but the year after. So there's a few projects that I'm involved in there with that at the moment. So I physically don't have the mental capability to get myself emotionally involved in another documentary at the moment. I would love to, other than this particular one that I'm tentatively working on at the moment, about my dad. But other than that, I think it'll be a while before I throw myself back into that, because they're too time consuming. They take an awful lot of work, and as you know, it's very hit or miss as to how much money you actually get back from these things. And it doesn't matter how good the thing is, and even if you get it out on a good viewing platform, the returns, what they actually give you for it, as you know, is negligible. For the effort kind of put in. So I find if you want to do a really good documentary, it's got to be like a real pet love kind of project. You can't think about doing it as a means to making money, really.
No, it's a labour of love. It definitely is. Any more books in the pipeline? I remember we had you up here when you brought this out, which was a cracking book. It's well worth a look. I'm sure you can still pick them up on Amazon, etc. The Great Train Robbery.
Yeah, that's the most up-to-date one, and it's got my dad's last thoughts on it and Ronnie's, and it came out the 50th anniversary the same year that my dad and Ronnie died, actually. And it's got bits and pieces that haven't come out in other books, and it's worth getting. There's some great pictures in there. I think it's probably still available on Amazon. I don't have any books particularly. I was thinking I might, if I can find enough of some of the stuff that was taken out of my dad's book originally, and it's worthwhile putting in, and I won't get sued for putting it in there. I might re-release my dad's book. It's never come out in an audio format. I did think possibly about maybe getting David Thewlis or someone like that to narrate my dad's book and put it out, or maybe having it out on some kind of platform like on like Kindle, some electronic version of it, because that hasn't been done yet. But otherwise, not really. Unless it's something about me putting his biography out. I can't see myself actually doing another book for the 60th, because there isn't anything new really to add to it, other than the last of the few key players have died in those 10 years. Obviously, there's nothing new that's really come out that warrants an update of it at the moment. Really, the only bit of news came out maybe is one documentary in the news named one of the 3 that got away, but that's not enough to redo a book and fill up the last 10 years really. And both of the books I did, that one and the other one, the reason that I did them is that the story had still been in the press every year, no matter what, all of those years. And even over the last 10 years since then, it's still in the news when it's an anniversary still. But, with most of the key players being dead now, there's not much reason for it, to get mentioned. And other than the fact, as I said, everyone loves an anniversary. And so I know there's about 6 or 7 companies at the moment trying to find an angle on making a documentary for the 60th. There's been talk about doing a movie. There's been talk about doing a series, like a HBO type thing. There's been various, that have all started up and fallen down, mainly because if you want to tell that story properly, it's going to be, very expensive, because, you're trying to recreate, the end of the 50s, the 60s. You've got all of that, and to bring it up to the modern day, it's going to be a very, very expensive thing to do, unless you use an excessive lot of kind of green screening and stuff like that, to recreate that period and to get it right. I mean, the BBC did, I don't know, you probably remember better than I do, but they did quite a good 2-parter, didn't they, a few years back?
Yeah, it was good. They can get it on DVD, I think. Yeah.
And that was very well done. But apart from them doing that, and ITV doing Mrs. Biggs, there hasn't really been, as I said, a lot about the train robbery, and no other major information has come out that would warrant, there's not enough to fill another 10 years to go, hey, this is the train robbery, 60 years on. So I don't see myself doing anything there. And, to answer your question, unless I can, as I said, find some stuff that wasn't in my dad's initial book. If there's enough to warrant a reprint with some extra bit in it, no. Is your answer?
No problem. Mrs. Biggs, of course, was ITV. I've just managed to find that. That was the Great Train Robbery on BBC. So both of them are available on Amazon and on various buying services. So get a look at it. They're well worth a watch. That one's well worth a watch. Last thought on your dad then. I mean, what do you think your dad's legacy is? There's a photo of your dad at my book launch. It was great of him to come down and support that. Met him on many occasions. He even, if I remember rightly, you and him shared my spare room on one occasion when you came to Newcastle. So
yeah, we did.
And we had a night out, and we went to St James's Park, didn't we?
That's it. We went to the you took us to the stadium.
Yeah.
I remember sitting there in an empty stadium, which was quite strange.
Yeah.
It's like being on some weird ghost ship or something. But
Well, I mean, yeah. What's your dad's legacy? Do you think? What has he left behind? He's no longer with us, which is a crying shame. He was a lovely man. What would you say is his legacy?
his
Difficult
legacy.
question, I know.
Well, I mean, it's funny you should ask that, because when he had pneumonia for a week when I was with him, staying with him, to when he died, and the the last night he was alive, as I put him to bed, I said, is there anything I can get you, anything you want, and I cleared his table by the side of his bed, and I said, is there a book or anything you want, anything like that? And he went, get me that book on those Peruvian mercenaries, will you? I went, what? I thought it was a bit abstract. And anyway, I couldn't find it. And he said, oh, okay. He goes, well, in the bottom drawer of that cupboard there's a brown paper envelope, and there's a copy of my biography in there. And he said, can you get me that? Which I thought was an odd request. I said, okay. So I got that and I put it next to him. And anyway, in the morning, when I woke up and I went into his room, and unfortunately, I found him and he was dead. But the way he was lying was that he turned his head and his nose was about that far away from his book. It was almost like he was pointing at it. And I guess really, I mean, his legacy is really his book. It explains to the public how someone from a working class background ended up becoming one of the world's most known thieves through his association with one of the world's most known crimes. His criminal life, but that he'd made his mark in the sand, and for him, that was his legacy. And once a great train robber, always a great train robber. He said you can never escape that legacy, and so therein is his legacy, I guess you could say, and he is. I'm lucky in as much as I had a great relationship with him, and by all account, he was a thoroughly decent chap who was well loved, well respected, treated people very nicely. I've never come across anyone who's really had a bad word or had a run-in with him. Even old Eddie Richardson, and they famously fell out at some point. I think when they was in Parkhurst together or something like that. But even Eddie's got a good word to say, and come up to me once and said, I always liked your dad, but I thought he was a bit, but I always had respect for the guy, and it's good to hear that. Even today, I'm running into people, and will say to me, "Oh, I was a mate of your dad's, and he was a lovely geezer," and and ladies too, and it's very heartwarming that he was remembered in such a nice way, and I don't mean just from the people that was associated, with villains, all across the board, from celebrities, from authors to actors, even to crime journalists and reporters and people like that. My dad got on with everybody and anybody. In fact, when my dad was in prison, funny enough, the Archbishop of Canterbury used to visit him, and he would have a chat with the prison governor afterwards, and so what a terrible waste, that someone like Bruce should have ended up in prison when he was obviously so capable. He could have done so many other things, and to which my dad's sort of response was, or how he envisaged himself was, he was an artist who basically landed on the wrong canvas.
Yeah, Great stuff, great legacy, great life, and a great man. Thank you to Spider VPN for their sponsorship. Google Spider VPN, they come up at the top of your search list and they will protect your computer and everything on it. Thanks to skipsandbins.com, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website www.skipsandbins.com. Easy, contract free, and pay as you go waste collection. Thanks to L&G Family Funeral Directors 01913897245 and to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle. And thanks to Jab Signature, jabsignature.co.uk. If you want to subscribe, hit the Newcastle Legends logo in the bottom right-hand corner. Hit the thumb up to like the video, click share to share to your social media, and drop into the comments box to leave a comment. And we're also available on iTunes, Spotify, and all podcast providers. Podcast usually goes up 24 hours after the show. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man. Best of luck with all your projects, and looking forward to seeing you back up in Newcastle with the Alabama 3 very soon.
Yeah, well, thank you, Stephen. I'll just say I like the fact that one of your sponsors happens to be Undertakers. You don't happen to have a pig farm as well, do you?
No comment. Take care, mate. God bless you.
Take care, mate. All the best.